attention to you this day in the teaching that you have for us from. You may be seated. At this time, the children, ages 3 through 5th grade, are dismissed for your Answers Bible curriculum. It looks like Leonie may be the person taking you here this morning. Well, I've mentioned to you before how one of my close friends has been unlawfully detained by the Taliban in Central Asia. He still, to this day, is unlawfully detained. Of course, that is a risk to workers from the West, and sometimes there is even a risk of torture or death, but that's usually not the greatest risk for Westerners. Rather, the greatest risk for people from the West is that they will be sent out of the country. That's typically what it entails. Rather, the risk for people in the country, though, that is much more severe. In other words, the risk to a religious worker may be bad, but it's nothing like what those people face themselves when their lives are changed, and then they subsequently might be arrested or detained, or even framed for murder, as has happened. That in order to get rid of these Christians, they will frame them for murder. They truly suffer more than we could ever imagine. Well, that being the case, deciding whether to extract new believers from the country or whether to keep them in the country is one of the most difficult things that we can do as missionaries. Sure, we love these new believers and we want to see their lives continue. But if we extract all of them from their homelands, no one is there to stand up for them. Still, it's not an easy decision because we don't face that same danger. One young Saudi woman we know of came to faith through Arab World Ministries' online website. Arab World Ministries was the mission that we went with overseas, and then that merged into Pioneers. She was just glowing with enthusiasm and warmth in her newfound relationship with Jesus. And she shared poetry that she had written and letters to her fellow Saudi people. She hadn't sent these, but they were just written, and she shared them with the person online that had led her to the Lord. She appealed to her fellow Muslims to take hold of the truth of the gospel, which had been repressed for 1,400 years in her country of Saudi Arabia. Then, silence. Months went by with nothing, until a news report was made public that the daughter of the head of the Secret Service was taken by her father and brothers to the backyard of their home, where her father cut out her tongue, burned her. That was this young woman. I can't speak to that from my own experience. We don't face that sort of persecution here in the United States. Certainly, the stakes aren't that high to include that sort of punishment. In another instance, there were 2 teenage boys from a large city in the United Arab Emirates who had professed faith in Jesus. The uncle of one of them was literally hunting them from city to city throughout the country, threatening to kill them. And once I had the opportunity to take them meals from Hardee's, of all places. Another time from McDonald's. In that instance, we helped them flee rather than encouraging them to stay. You can see each of these situations, they are so difficult. We longed for someone who might make it clear, like maybe an angel that just shows up, appearing in the middle of the night, telling exactly what's the right thing to do in this particular scenario. That's what we have today in Matthew chapter 2. So I'd invite you to turn with me your Bibles to Matthew chapter 2, where we'll be looking at verses 19 through 25, I think, today. We're going to look individually at each of the verses together. Now, last week, I made much of Joseph's obedience to the Lord, speaking to him through dreams. That's how the Lord spoke to Joseph, and that was a powerful thing for him at that time. I noted that when the Lord has a line of communication open to people, and those people are obedient to that line of communication, they don't need another line of communication. For many people in the Middle East and North Africa, dreams and visions are that line of communication. For many people in the Indian subcontinent, healings are that line of communication. For many people in Africa and South America, miraculous wonders like people walking on burning fire are that thing that gets their attention and causes them to believe the word that is spoken. For many people in the West, logic and reasoning are that communication channel. I'll use myself as an example of that last type. When I was 19 years old, I was reading a book that showed that the last of the giants opposing Christianity were Hinduism and Islam. Since communism had fallen, the last of the giants were Hinduism and Islam. And I was so overwhelmed by the statistics, particularly about Muslims and how few people go to the Muslim lands. They simply do not have an opportunity to hear the gospel without someone personally sharing it with them. I was so overwhelmed by this, by reading these statistics, that I grabbed my sister's dog and went for a walk around the block. I remember the very house I was standing in front of where it just made sense. If I wanted to meet the greatest need, and this was the greatest need, this is where I needed to be. So, from that point forward, I arranged my class schedule. I arranged my reading schedule, my books, any newspaper articles or magazines that I could get. I did reports and papers on the Middle East, even in classes where it wasn't required. I visited mosques, local mosques. I started to take Arabic classes, all so that I could be prepared to take the gospel to Muslims. I even studied abroad in Cairo because of what the Lord did in front of 43 West 12th Street in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. And you can see, if we advance forward there, we'll see a picture of 43 West 12th Street. Maybe we'll see. But it's kind of freaky in a way, isn't it? I mean, these people did nothing to deserve this, and yet now they're being highlighted in some sermon by a weirdo pastor who had this thing go on right in front of their house at that sidewalk, 43 West 12th Street. And they didn't deserve that, but nonetheless, God is using that because God changed lives, changed my life for certain, and other lives that he continues to impact because of what he did right on that sidewalk there. God had a direct line to speak to me that I will obey. It makes sense, so I'm going to do it. I didn't need a dream or a vision or a healing or a miracle because he speaks to me so clearly through my own mind, through making things make sense, through rationalizing through it, through putting these pieces together and seeing, well, that just makes sense. That's what I've got to do. For Joseph, his dreams were that direct communication channel. 4 times God spoke directly to him in dreams. Is there anyone else in all of Scripture that heard God's voice in dreams more than that? Maybe Daniel, but Joseph, this small character whose biggest attribute was his last name, was his ancestry that he passed on to Jesus. This character was someone who heard the Lord's voice repeatedly through dreams, and that's the major lesson for us. When God speaks to you, whether he speaks through dreams or visions or voices or miracles or your mind, do what God said. So, here are those 4 dreams. Nazareth was the first one where he received this dream. I'm going to have you advance these in the back. The battery must be here. But Nazareth was the first one, and he received instruction. It wasn't a warning. The instruction was, take it easy and take Mary as your wife. Okay, that's the first dream that he had. The second one was in Bethlehem. Now, this is a warning. Get up and get out. That's what he was basically told. The third one was when he was in Egypt, and again, he gets instruction. Yo, take it easy and take a road trip and go back to Israel, the land that I want you to be in. And then the fourth one was in Bethlehem. Here's another warning. Another one from Bethlehem and another warning. Keep moving. It ain't safe here. So if you're Joseph and you're taking stock of your dreams, you might never want to visit your ancestral hometown of Bethlehem again. I mean, think about it. He wakes up in terror twice each time he visits Bethlehem. Nazareth, Joseph got this encouragement, but in Bethlehem, he got a warning. In Egypt, he got this instruction. In Bethlehem, he got a warning. In fact, Joseph obeyed more directly than even his parallel, Moses. Now, Moses is seen as one of the great fathers of Israel, but he argued and he whined with the Lord. I don't want to go to Pharaoh. Send someone else. I mean, how about my brother? He's a better public speaker. God, that's what you really need, is a public speaker. Yeah, send my brother. He's a better person rather than me. Moses had his own run for your life moment. Remember that? Moses was a murderer. We don't often think of it that way, but J.B. Pritzker's administration would definitely throw him in the clink for vigilante justice. That's what Moses executed. Moses didn't report the injustice of an Egyptian beating up on one of his fellow Israelites. He gave him the 1-2 and knocked him dead, and so he ran. Moses ran. Kenny Rogers said it well. He said, you got to know when to hold them, you got to know when to fold them, know when to walk away, and know when to run. Well, Moses knew when to run, and that was that time. Now, I don't want to be too hard on Moses here, because after all, as I shared last week, there is grace when we make a bad decision, and we come back later to make a better decision. If Moses hadn't run from Pharaoh, would he have had the firm resolve that we see stand up to Pharaoh 40 years later? I mean, no doubt God used that 40 years when Moses ran away. He used that 40 years of thinking through his decision. Did I do the right thing? Was it right for me to run? I mean, yes, I was standing up for my brother, but was it the right thing? You know, if I have that opportunity again, I'm going to stand up to Pharaoh. That's probably what built up in his mind over those 40 years. And so we have this sense of resolve from Moses. Would that have been there had he not made a bad decision and spent 40 years thinking about that bad decision? Now, here's what Moses hears. In Exodus chapter 4, verse 19, it says this, and the Lord said to Moses in Midian, go back to Egypt, for all the men who were seeking you, your life, are dead. Those are almost the same words that were spoken to Joseph that we read in Matthew chapter 2, verses 20 to 21, saying, rise, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. He rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Moses had left Egypt on his own personal exodus as he ran for his life. He was called back to Egypt in a reverse exodus so that he could lead the Hebrews in the real exodus. Now, consider Joseph, who was called to a reverse exodus to flee to Egypt, only to be called back in Jesus' personal exodus from Egypt so that he could lead the people of God in the ultimate exodus from their sins. I'm going to read that again because it's kind of hard to put those two pieces together, but the person of Moses compared to the person of Joseph and Jesus. Moses had left Egypt on his own personal exodus. He ran for his life. He was called back to Egypt in a reverse exodus so that he could lead the Hebrews in the real exodus. Joseph, on the other hand, was called in a reverse exodus to go to Egypt only to be called back in Jesus' personal exodus from Egypt, so that he could lead the people of God in the ultimate exodus from their sins. The typology between Moses and Jesus is unmistakable. And it starts with those perceptive dreams that Joseph had. Perceptive dreams make a Nazarene. Now, our second point here today is that you need to know when to fold them. The mass slaughter of these toddlers in the region around Bethlehem was undoubtedly all that Joseph and Mary could handle. I mean, there weren't videos of news updates running 24 hours a day in Egypt so that they would know what happened in Bethlehem. In other words, when they got back to Bethlehem, they found out what happened in Bethlehem because of their departure from Bethlehem. Just think of the grief that would be overwhelming them as they came back into this little town. They might have heard about it through the grapevine in Egypt, but they didn't put together maybe the pieces that every one of the little boys that knew, these families that had given birth to a little toddler and had raised him the same age as Jesus, every one of them had suffered greatest loss in families. As you put yourselves in their shoes for a minute, consider what sort of survivor's guilt they would have. In fact, in no small measure, their son was the reason that these 30 distinct families suffered the death. Of course, Joseph and Mary didn't commit the heinous acts of murder, but they escaped the skin of their teeth because of Joseph's. He left in the middle of the night. He obeyed in the middle of the night, fled for his life because he was warned. What words would Joseph and Mary have for their relatives as they introduced Jesus, who had grown a year older and a year bigger and was learning so many new things? Grief would be torn open again for their relatives as they realized that their sons hadn't grown another year, that their sons hadn't gotten another year bigger, that their sons weren't going through these stages of growth, of learning new things. They even resent Jesus because he survived. Their grief almost palpable. Herod's massacre of all the male toddlers of Bethlehem was likely one of his last acts in 5 or 4 BC. He croaked in 4 BC, and his kingdom was divided between his 3 sons. The paranoid slaughter of these innocent boys was entirely unhelpful to protect Herod's rule of Israel. His rule was going to end anyway. This was his last year of his rule, the last year of his life. But of course, he didn't know that. So he sacrificed these boys in order to try to perpetuate his rule. God won, Herod lost. Even though God ultimately prevailed, the life of the wicked man, Herod the Great, was a demonstration of God allowing evil, still working. God allowing bad decisions and horrible decisions, but still using those for the ultimate good of those who love him. Listen to the epitaph of Herod the Great from Flavius Josephus, a historian from the 1st century. A man he was of great barbarity toward all man equally, and a slave to his passions, but above the consideration of what is right. Yet was he favored by fortune as much as any man ever was. For from a private man he became a king. And though he were encompassed by 10,000 dangers, he got clear of them all and his life very old. It's kind of the opposite of what you'd expect from the book of Job. The book of Job See, there's this idea in the book of Job that good people get good things and that bad people get bad things. But we know that that's not what always happens, does it? Job is testimony to that. Herod is also testimony. Such a horrible person seemed to have everything go right. That's the life of Herod. Well, the son of Herod that we know best was Herod Antipas, who ruled over Galilee, that is the region of Nazareth. He was the Herod that Jesus himself called a fox. And he was the Herod that was called to account for his immorality by John the Baptist. What happened there? Well, it ended up in John the Baptist losing his life because he had been imprisoned by that Herod Antipas. Well, Herod Philip II, he ruled over Iturea and Trachonitis, right? East and north of Galilee. That's what you need to picture in your mind. East and north of Galilee. Finally, Archelaus ruled over Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. Archelaus was the son who inherited his father's cruelty. In fact, he was so hated by the Jews that they protested against him to Rome. So Archelaus killed them, 3,000 of them. Herod had killed 30 to 60 toddlers. His son just wiped out 3,000 of the Jews that protested against him, that kind of reported him to Caesar's government in Rome. Josephus records that Archelaus fled to Rome after this uprising took place to make his case to Caesar, thinking that his brothers Antipas and Philip and Herod's sister, his aunt Salome, that she would stand up for him. And here's how Josephus records this next part of Archelaus' life. And when he was come to Rome, all his relations revolted to him, not out of their goodwill toward him, but out of their hatred to Archelaus. What to do with someone like that, right? Even his family said, "No, this guy is evil." And sure enough, what happened? Well, send him to France. They banished him to Gaul, and that's the last we hear of this murderous Archelaus. But now you know what happened to France. Now you know a little bit of why Joseph himself was afraid when Archelaus was made ruler over that land of Bethlehem. Joseph, the adopted father of Jesus, he knew he shouldn't trust Archelaus. And that was confirmed in yet another dream. Instead of staying in his ancestral home of Bethlehem, he had to fold him. He had to go. He had to leave. He wouldn't gamble with the lives of his family, especially considering the way that his dream corroborated his injury. I know this guy Archelaus. I know he's a bad dude. I've got this dream that says the same thing. I'm out of here. I can't stay around knowing what he's done to the toddlers in Bethlehem. Now, this was the second instance then that Joseph was warned in a dream, run away. In this way, God did not leave the protection of his son to chance. He did not leave the safety of the Messiah to reason alone. He intervened into the historical flow of events to ensure that his son was spared a premature death. Perceptive dreams make a Nazarene. That's exactly what happened with Jesus. On account of the perceptive dreams of Joseph, he and his immediate family moved to Nazareth and became known as Nazarene. Well, that brings us to our third point, which is home away from home. As we turn to the last verse of the chapter 2, which is verse 23, it's important to note something about the word Nazarene. The word is very close to a word from the Old Testament, Nazarite, but it's not the same. A Nazarite is not someone who is born and raised and lives in Nazareth. A Nazarite is someone like Samson, for example. Samson is an example of a Nazarite. That's a person whose parents take a vow or that person takes a vow, and the vow, it's a special type. It shows that this person was dedicated to the Lord. So Samson, his hair was never cut. He was never supposed to drink wine or grape products at all, or any strong drink. And he was never supposed to touch a corpse. Dedicate himself to the Lord. Well, we know some of the story of Samson, don't we? He personally saw a bunch of honey from the bees that were in a lion's carcass. Well, what is a carcass but a corpse? And he scoops this out. Oh, that's good stuff. And that was the substance of the riddle by which he fooled the Philistines. So he did that himself. And then he also gave away his secret, saying that he was dedicated to the Lord since his youth, and his secret was in his long hair. They cut his hair, and his strength went away. Of course, that doesn't describe Jesus, whose first miracle was making water into wine. Now, what about being a Nazarene from Nazareth, though? Where is that prophesied in the Old Testament? Well, it's not. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, that Matthew appeals to fulfilling the prophecies, the prophets, and what the prophets said, but there's no prophecy in the Old Testament that says that Jesus will be a Nazarene. So what are we to make of this? Well, I want to put something before you here that Matthew is likely referring to the Hebrew root NZR, and that's what you see here. NZR was the root for branch. That's what it meant. And you know that there are prophecies in the Old Testament about the branch of the Lord, right? But it's also the root of the word Nazareth. And so when Matthew says Nazarene, he's kind of all-encompassing, pulling together the 6 prophecies that were about the messianic branch, the branch from which life would grow. This would be, it's almost as though a stump was cut. This is exactly the way that Nazar is that a stump was cut, and you think that the tree is dead. That's what happened in 586 BC. You look at the people of Israel and you think, oh, they've all been taken away to Babylon. This is it. No more. Israel is done for. And then out of that grows a branch of new life that is going to spread and bring about life for everyone. That is Jesus. So when Matthew says Nazar, so Nazarene, from Nazareth, he's saying branch. Jesus is the Messiah. He's the one that was talked about in these 6 different places. So we see that in Isaiah 4:2. We see that in Jeremiah 23:5. We see that in Jeremiah 33:15. We see that in Zechariah 3:8 and in Zechariah 6:12. So across 3 different prophets, we have these 6 different prophecies about the branch. Those are 5 of the 6. I want to focus in on one of those in particular, and that is from Isaiah. You and I are that fruit that's going to grow from that branch if we believe and trust in the branch, Jesus. We are part of that prophecy. I want to elaborate on one of these prophecies to kind of show you where this comes about and the great meaning that we put on this, the great joy, the great hope that we have of the end times, this branch. So here it is. In chapter 11 of Isaiah, you're welcome to follow along, or you can watch on the screen there. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. Okay, so now we've got the Nazar. The Nazar is in the picture. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, and the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. Well, where do we hear that? Jesus himself cites this passage. He opens the scroll of Isaiah to this passage to say, the Spirit of the Lord will rest upon him. and his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he will judge the poor, and decide with equity the meek, or for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Finally, justice comes. Finally, those Romans who just think that they can go slaughter 60 of our toddlers for no reason at all. Finally, justice is going to come, and it's going to come through this man, the branch. Righteousness shall be the belt of his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins. Now here, this is the end times. This is the end result. This is what we look for and what we long for about this Messiah. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, and their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the adder's den. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover. Lord, make it happen. Lord, let that be the description of our lives, and let it happen soon. We want that sort of leadership. We want that can only come from Jesus, the Messiah, the branch, the Nazarene. What a beautiful day that will be. That is what we have to look forward to, all because Jesus was protected as this little child by a man named Joseph. Jesus is our righteous branch. Praise Jesus. So what are you going to do about this? As we consider all of this, as we look at all these pieces tied together, there's obviously great meaning in the person of Jesus. Well, I want to put something in front of you here today. We're talking about dreams. We're talking about visions. We're talking about people from the Middle East. I want to challenge you with this. If you see a Muslim this next week, ask that person, have you ever seen a dream of a man dressed in all white? That's it. You don't have to have all the answers and everything behind it. Just ask that one simple question. Have you ever seen a dream of a man dressed in? And who are you going to tell? Is there someone that you can tell about all the significance, the meaning that you have in your own soul because of your love? Lord Jesus, I do pray.